Imagine a world where Germany triumphed in World War I, dismantling the Allies and reshaping Europe under the Reich's iron grip, with global ripple effects set off by a single victory. The spring offensive of 1918 pushed the Allies to their limits before American troops fully arrived, and in this scenario, the Treaty of Versailles never happens. Instead, Germany redraws the map, not just in Europe but across the globe, with plans for a massive colonial empire in Africa, Mittelafrika waiting in the wings. But what would it take for Germany to actually win, and how close did they really come? Let's break down the moment that could have changed everything. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, bringing fresh troops, resources, and momentum to the exhausted Allies. But what if the US had stayed neutral? Picture the trenches in 1918, France and Britain barely holding on, their armies battered from years of relentless fighting. Without American boots on the ground or massive shipments of supplies, the balance of power in Europe leans dramatically in Germany's favor. The strained Allied forces, already racked by internal turmoil, might not have been able to mount key defenses like they did in the war we know. By this point, nations on both sides were running on fumes. Germany, in particular, faced severe shortages, especially in food and materials. Its infamous submarine campaigns, while disruptive, also provoked international outrage, especially with the sinking of civilian ships. These attacks escalated tensions with the US and eventually helped pull America into the conflict. Without the prospect of US intervention, Germany's leadership could have taken fewer risks, easing up on unrestricted submarine warfare and focusing on surviving the war of attrition that had gripped Europe by then. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, morale was dangerously low. In 1917, the French army faced a massive mutiny after soldiers refused to continue launching doomed offensives against German lines. Troops were physically and mentally spent. Without the infusion of American forces and equipment, the French high command would have had even fewer ways to motivate their men. The cracks were already showing, and it wasn't just the French. Britain's efforts to weather the war depended on the steady economic and military support coming from across the Atlantic. Remove that lifeline, and their ability to continue a prolonged conflict becomes much murkier. Then there's Germany's own strategy in 1918. Their spring offensive was their Hail Mary, a desperate push to break through the Western Front before US forces arrived in full strength. At first, it seemed successful. German troops advanced further than they had in years, using innovative infiltration tactics to bypass traditional frontline defenses. For a fleeting moment, it looked like Paris was within reach, but the offensive stalled, partly due to logistical problems and partly because the Allies, now bolstered by American reinforcements, could counter the push. Without those reinforcements, though, German forces might not have been stopped. One advantage Germany could have leaned into was time. By focusing on a defensive war instead of an all-or-nothing attack, they might have been able to slowly grind down the Allies through attrition. France and Britain were dealing with economic collapse and dwindling manpower, and Germany's defensive lines were still formidable. The idea would have been to force the Allies into a corner, either accept peace on German terms or risk complete exhaustion. Attrition warfare is brutal, but in a world without the US propping up the Allies, it's easier to imagine it working. And what would victory look like? The fall of Paris would have been a psychological and logistical hammer blow to France, likely compelling their government to seek an armistice. With France out of the picture, Britain would have found itself isolated and under pressure to negotiate, unable to continue a lone fight across the Channel. The resulting peace treaty would have been dictated entirely by Germany and its allies, carving out territorial gains, extracting colonies, and demanding reparations from their defeated enemies. But here's where things get tricky. Even after forcing the Allies to surrender, a victorious Germany would still face monumental challenges. Taking Paris might end the war, but the sheer scope of dominating post-war Europe presents a different kind of problem. However, the potential collapse of Allied resistance in 1918 remains a haunting possibility, one that underscores just how pivotal US involvement really was. For Germany, this alternate victory was only the beginning of something far more complex. Germany's triumph in World War I wouldn't have just ended in military victory. It would have kicked off an ambitious redefinition of Europe and the wider world. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in early 1918, had already demonstrated Germany's appetite for expansion. In its original terms, Russia was forced to abandon its control over vast territories, giving up Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Crimea. Under a victorious Germany, these regions would have been absorbed into its economic and political orbit. While they might have been labeled as independent nations, their autonomy would have been more symbolic than real. German leaders planned to dominate these territories, from their economies to their governments, cementing their grip over Eastern Europe. A puppet network, heavily reliant on German settlers and administrators, would have anchored this domination, ensuring power flowed from Berlin outward. Then there was the Kaiser's grand plan for Mittelafrika. Germany envisioned creating an enormous colonial empire across Africa, redefining the colonial map entirely. The design would consolidate German holdings in places like Tanzania and Cameroon, while seizing key territories from Britain, France, and Belgium. In this scenario, the iconic Congo Basin, along with strategic corridors of West and East Africa, would have fallen under the Reich's control, turning the continent into a massive resource mine for Germany's expanding economic machine. The scale of this ambition was staggering. Imagine a single, contiguous empire stretching across equatorial Africa, giving Germany dominance over everything from diamonds and rubber to the valuable shipping routes along the continent's coasts. On paper, this plan rivaled even Britain's colonial hold of the time. But the redrawing didn't stop there. Back in Europe, defeat wouldn't spare France any mercy. With Paris in German hands, the peace terms would have been brutal. Harsh reparations would have been imposed, echoing what the victorious Allies imposed on Germany in reality. These would have crippled France's post-war recovery, locking the once proud nation into economic submission for decades. Germany had already laid out plans to annex Belgium outright, expanding the Reich's western borders far past the Rhine. From there, the line between victors and the vanquished wouldn't just divide borders, but also resources. France, stripped of its colonies and wealth, would have watched helplessly as Germany doubled down on exporting its influence abroad. Yet, no plan shaped this new world order more than Germany's strategy of economic mastery. Secured resources from Eastern Europe and Africa would feed an industrial boom, powering Germany's rise as the world's unrivaled economic superpower. German settlers, encouraged to move east, would farm fertile Ukrainian lands, mine rich supplies of coal and iron, and create a new backbone for an empire that stretched even beyond Europe. Much like how the United States capitalized on the post-World War II era to spread its economic dominance, Germany would have used its victory to further its cultural, industrial, and political supremacy across multiple continents. Of course, such dominance wouldn't have gone unchecked. Britain wasn't just going to fade into irrelevance without resistance. Though stripped of key African territories, the empire would have likely focused inward, rebuilding its industrial strength while navigating uneasy post-war alliances. Meanwhile, for France, the humiliation of 2 German victories in 50 years wouldn't have been easy to swallow. Nationalist revolts may have simmered in Paris while the Germans tightened their grip. Whether these defeated foes could regroup or fully recover is a question with no easy answer. By this point, Germany's vision extended so far that even its leadership may have felt the strain. The Kaiser, increasingly sidelined by military and government officials during the war, might have found his influence eroding further. Incompetence, after all, wasn't an asset in managing such a sprawling empire. Germany's new ambitions might have been bold, but even bolder forces, economic strain, colonial resistance, and rebellion from within its puppet states, were already brewing under the surface. It's here that cracks in the system, no matter how victorious it seemed, might have started to show. After Germany's victory, the war might have ended, but the foundations of peace would have been incredibly fragile. Europe's landscape, political and physical, would be scarred by resentment and chaos. Take France, for example, a nation forced to surrender after the fall of Paris. The humiliation of defeat wouldn't disappear with time. Stripped of territory, burdened by crippling reparations, and under constant German oversight, the French people would likely grow restless. Nationalist movements could spark almost immediately, fueled by anger toward their occupiers. And the British, isolated by the shocking collapse of their allies, wouldn't be much better. A diminished empire and the loss of crucial colonies to Germany's Mittelafrika scheme would have left deep scars among imperialists back home. For both these defeated powers, recovery wouldn't just be slow, it might never have been complete without significant repercussions. Meanwhile, Germany's influence over Eastern Europe would plant more seeds of conflict, with the Bolsheviks crushed in the Russian Civil War. Thanks in part to German military intervention, a Soviet Union never rises. But Russian resistance wouldn't completely vanish. Germany's control over puppet states like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics would inspire guerrilla wars across the region. Hundreds of smaller insurgencies could have kept Eastern Europe simmering with hostility, draining German resources and attention. And with no Soviet Union to challenge Germany, there's another complication: a massive power vacuum. Balkan rivalries and ethnic tensions would have exploded sooner or later, pulling Germany into endless conflicts far from its Western priorities. Globally, alliances might have looked radically different. Japan, sensing an opening as the Allies faltered, could have joined the Central Powers toward the end of the war. Even if they started as opportunists, they would have emerged from the conflict as major players in Germany's new order. With fewer checks on their ambitions, Japan might have seized Indochina, Hong Kong, or other key territories in Asia as spoils of war. And all the while, the United States, the game changer in the actual war, might have sat quietly on the sidelines, clinging to isolationism as Europe and Asia descended deeper into instability. But Europe's defeated nations wouldn't accept this new status quo forever. Britain and France, likely weathering economic collapse and political extremism, could have turned to extreme ideologies to cope. While fascism defined nations like Italy and Germany after the war in our timeline, here it could have easily gripped London or Paris first. Imagine a French government led by monarchists, military elites, and nationalists promising to avenge their country's humiliation. Or Britain falling to a hard-right authority, relying on imperial nostalgia to justify aggression against the German Reich. Either way, authoritarianism would have risen as the defeated nations rallied under banners of vengeance. On the other side, even a victorious Germany wouldn't be immune to trouble. Its rapid expansion would have left it vulnerable to nationalist revolts within its sprawling empire. From Belgian dissent to resistance in Eastern Europe, an overstretched Reich would face rising unrest. Economic problems could have piled on, too. Dominating colonies in Africa might have looked good on paper, but sustaining a massive empire spread across continents requires resources and manpower that Germany may not have had to spare. Factor in the global fallout from the Great Depression, a challenge no nation would escape, and you have the perfect conditions for another major confrontation. This volatile system of rivalries and unrest couldn't last. France, itching for revenge, could have allied itself with Britain and smaller European nations looking to regain their sovereignty. Across the globe, new conflicts might have erupted. Japan could have overstepped in Asia, provoking both Germany and Western nations, potentially dragging the entire region into chaos. And then there's the US, still an economic giant, watching from the sidelines, with the capacity to tip the scales once more. So, would this German order have lasted? The signs say no. The defeated power's fury, combined with Germany's own overreaching ambitions, could only end one way: another global war, this time with even higher stakes. As the fragile balance cracked, the world would brace for yet another reckoning, shaped this time by Germany's dominance instead of its defeat. A German victory in World War I wouldn't have brought peace. It would have reshaped conflicts on a massive scale. New borders, puppet states, and colonial empires would have created as many grievances as they resolved, leaving nations bitter and unstable. Without the Soviet Union or American intervention, Germany's dominance might have seemed unstoppable. But power like that rarely lasts unchecked. History shows that the more a nation expands its ambitions, the more fragile its foundation becomes. So, how much power could Germany have held before it all unraveled? In the end, dominance might have been the start of its downfall. What epic what-if world would you explore next? Share your ideas below. If you loved this video, smash that like button, subscribe for more mind-blowing alternate histories, and hit the bell. Our next adventure drops soon with another game-changing twist. Catch you in another world of the wildest what-ifs.